Welcome to Sino Warfare with Ralph D. Sawyer. The simplest form of structured incendiary attack requires troops to physically approach gates, palisades, other exposed kind of perimeter targets and set them afire. Practice from the 5th century BC onward, it required great courage to execute under a hail of enemy projectiles. Specialists known as incendiary troops therefore gradually evolved and were continuously employed from the 7th through the 17th centuries AD, when tube weapons, cannon, and so forth became prominent. Exploiting the silence, darkness of nighttime, cavalrymen with gag mouths would also race forward with an ignition source and bundles of reeds and firewood. Upon reaching their target and stacking the kindling, they would ignite the piles in unison for maximum effect. More surreptitiously, a few soldiers, or even just a single man, whether in disguise or simply exploiting the cover of night, could start a major fire by clandestinely penetrating a city or a camp and setting any of the readily flammable materials or structures ablaze. Since oil lamps and torches provided the only light, ignition sources, were always ready to hand. A Tang Dynasty military manual describes these incendiary agents. Pick a man who is courageous and nimble, whose speech and clothes are the same as the enemy. After filching their password, bearing fire, he should be dispatched to sneak into the enemy's encampment and burn their stores and provisions. When the fires start, he can exploit the confusion to get out. A late Ming Dynasty manual emphasized using subversives and blending into the environment. Commanders should select clever, skilled warriors who are strong enough to oppose 100 men. Have them pretend to be merchants or traders. Enter the city long before any action develops. One man bent on destruction can thus easily destroy the constructive efforts of thousands. It's simply a question of targeting for maximum effect, whether localized or expansive. Next on the historical stage, the development of incendiary assault devices and measures designed to overcome the advantages employed by defenders ensconced atop formidable walls. The earliest of these, the huocha, or incendiary cart, simply a cart or wagon loaded with faggots or dry brush that would be set afire just before being wheeled into position, expedited the quantitative delivery of combustible materials. Although they initially took the simplest form possible, variants with protective covering, including layers of mud to prevent them from being incinerated, allowed approaching. Where circumstances allowed, accelerants such as oil or lard were intermixed with the straw or kindling, significantly raising the temperature and increasing the chance that heavy wood targets such as gates would actually ignite. However, the possibility that these attacks could be thwarted with enough water, whether by pouring large quantities down from the top of the city walls or dropping water sacks that break open upon impact, prompted development of more complex weapons, such as this innocuous-looking one. Employed from perhaps the 12th century onward, it deviously combines oil's buoyancy with unconscious enemy complicity and disperses flaming liquids all about the vehicle. At the core is a cauldron of boiling oil, and it's overlaid with vines or rushes so that the oil's existence isn't apparent. Fires in the wagon's lower portion heat the oil, and faggots are sometimes played around the sides to augment the impression of a simple incendiary cart. Once pushed in position, water caused the volatile oil to splash out onto targets such as walls and gates, as well as creep underneath door leaves and swiftly spread the flames. In concord with developments that exploited smoke as an obscurant and a dispersive vehicle, an even more heinous incendiary cart that derived its lethality from noxious gases, including arsenic, appeared late. Horse-drawn, it relied upon speed to penetrate the enemy's encampment, where, quote, everyone who inhaled the smoke lost their lives, without even knowing how they ended. Over time, animal delivery systems, a kind of primitive form of automated strike that falls intermediate between direct assaults and missile fire, also evolved. Elephants were employed in China in 506 BC. But the first deliberate utilization of animals has traditionally been attributed to the great commander Tiandan, who ingeniously exploited a large number of fire oxen at the Battle of Jimo in 279 BC. Now, this is an incredibly famous episode that's long stirred the popular imagination. The extended siege has been depicted in more than one feature film, and it's justly considered the epitome of imaginative command. However, unlike true fire oxen carrying flammables intended to set the enemy's encampments ablaze, firebrands were tied to their tails to enrage the animals, something that could have been accomplished just by goading them with lances. The oxen thus merely served as self-powered shock elements, intended to pummel the enemy's siege lines, sow the confusion needed for a breakout. Fires ignited in the enemy's camp were merely ancillary, coincidental. Nevertheless, the episode has ever after been remembered as an incendiary assault, and it's immediately called to mind whenever besieged forces require desperate measures. The Battle of Jimo is fully reprised in our battle library. Over subsequent centuries, a variety of animals were co-opted to facilitate incendiary attacks, including monkeys, whose crazed behavior was exploited to set fires in an inaccessible mountain-top bastion. However, large, stampeding animals often prove problematic because they might turn back if wounded or terrified by enemy weapons. So delivery methods that could take advantage of normal behavior, such as birds returning to roost, and be more predictable, even if not fully controllable, obviously held appeal. Birds, chicken, wildfowl, whether running or flying, therefore generally formed the backbone of the animal arsenal. Several examples are recorded of using long cords to affix firebrands, or small containers of burning embers to the feet of chicken before scaring them into flying towards an enemy position. The Tang Dynasty Taibai Yinjing, previously mentioned, contains the first discussion of animal delivery systems. For large animals, the author advised employing gourds. Stuff burning moxa into gourds. Make 4 holes, then tie them to the necks of wild pigs or deer. Singe their tails and release them towards the enemy's encampment, causing them to race into the grass there. Fires will start when the gourds break. Many variants quickly appeared that employed both large and small animals, including oxen, though rarely horses because they were too valuable. The actual incendiary and its position also varied, some being placed on the animal's head, others hung from their necks or below their bodies. Now, the Taibai Yinjing advised using smaller tinder boxes for large birds. Empty out walnuts and make 2 holes in them. Fill them with burning moxa and tie them to the feet of wild chickens. Prick their tails and release them so that when they fly into the grass and the walnuts split open, fires will start. And finally, for sparrows, the smallest delivery vehicle, even more limited ones had to be created. Again, from the Taibai Yinjing, hollow out apricot cores, stuff them with burning moxa, and tie them to the feet of birds. Towards dusk, release a flock of them so they will fly into the city to roost for the night. Fires will shortly break out in any huts they congregate in. Now, of course, numbers here are being expected to compensate for the limited amount of ignition material that could be carried. In the Ming Dynasty, artificial firebirds that exploited China's tradition of large kite making appeared. The smallest, probably about as large as a western pigeon, were simply spheres with wings. They were launched into cities where they could scatter a small amount of burning material onto susceptible structures when they burst. However, they could also be used against troop deployments with the ancillary effect of blinding the soldiers with smoke. Their range was limited only by the strength of the wind and the length of their fuses. The second, a sort of precursor to drones, the V-1 rocket and the planes that struck the World Trade Center, was called a spiritual flying duck. It was considerably larger and had 4 rockets mounted beneath the wings, 2 to a side for lift. The bird's body, simply an elongated explosive, detonated over the enemy's encampment with a brilliant flash, igniting fires. Said to have a range of 800 feet, it was considered invincible in riverine conflict because it easily set the enemy's sails afire. Another unique weapon fancifully exploited the fire animal tradition by constructing a dummy cavalry rider around a complex gunpowder-powered arrow launcher, mounting him on a horse, and then lighting the fuse before sending him off into the enemy deployment or encampment by igniting a firebrand on the tail of the animal. Approximately human size, the rider had the appearance of a deity or ghost, so that when the device triggered, it terrified the soldiers. An incendiary device suspended underneath the horse generated multicolored smoke. And layer by layer, down through 17 layers, the dummy fired 105 arrows in all directions. A large watermelon-shaped bomb was encased at the bottom to further stun and blind the enemy, and the eyes and the mouth emitted small pebbles. It thus kind of constituted a self-powered offensive weapon. A doomsday device, incendiary arrows, termed Huojian or Huoshi, almost certainly originated simply wrapping rags soaked in lard or oil or alcohol and setting them afire. Their size and shape evolved over the centuries in tandem with the bow and arrow, the development of powerful crossbows in the Warring States period, and the appearance of huge arqueballista before the Sung, capable of firing oversized bolts several hundred paces. Gunpowder mixtures naturally increased their potency. Now, over the centuries, strategists deduced some basic operational principles. The arrows had to strike something flammable, and preferably impale a relatively inaccessible surface to prevent being immediately pulled out or extinguished. Heat, low humidity, and the presence of dense, dry vegetation were facilitators, but a moderate wind was known to be particularly auspicious. Finally, although a single arrow might strike an opportune target, mass volleys have a far greater chance of succeeding. By the Tang, incendiary arrows had advanced to using gourds filled with smoldering material fixed near the tip. Just a few decades later, crossbows became the preferred launcher, and the use of gunpowder with a comparatively low saltpeter composition, which means it will burn hot but not be explosive, and is therefore, ideally suited for incendiary devices, increased their effectiveness. And in the Song, a hybrid delivery method developed that employed distinct stages and discrete components to disperse a flammable medium onto the target and then ignite it, ensuring a high temperature and maximum duration of exposure, according to the instructions which first appeared in the Taibai Yinjing. Take small gourds full of oil, affix them to the tips of arrows, and shoot them onto the roofs of towers and turrets. After the gourds break and the oil disperses, use flaming arrows to hit the dispersed oil. As soon as fires are ignited, continue shooting gourds of oil. The towers and turrets will be completely incinerated. Even at the end of the Ming, when the cannon were displacing trebuchet-hurled explosive and incendiary bombs, incendiary arrows were still being employed in massive numbers and thought to be equally advantageous for both riverine and land warfare. Their effectiveness no less than tube weapons. Now, naturally, new versions appeared, including one with a small rocket attached, even though this seems kind of redundant because rockets themselves had already become prominent. Moreover, incendiary rockets were particularly appropriate for riverine warfare because they were the only way to strike the enemy's vessels before they closed for combat. A far more destructive approach from the Sung on was hurling incendiary bombs over walls with trebuchets and eventually catapults. Originally, these devices were employed to fling stones and noxious items like dead animals. Then containerized substance such as pots of burning oil, naphtha, and pre-explosive gunpowder devices. Even smoke balls were fabricated. This was done by increasing incendiary concoctions in heavy paper spheres, and poisonous substances were also added for augmented effect. Many were complex devices that wounded, as well as ignited or designed to be especially terrifying at night. Now finally, the oldest and simplest device for use in aquatic environments was a floating version of the fire cart known as a fire boat. As the military manuals all point out, simply by exploiting the wind or a conducive current, fire boats can proceed to their targets without animal power or further human intervention. Sophisticated designs aren't required. Any vessel with sufficiently side walls to pack a quantity of flammable material and, of course, fend off the spray and waves will suffice. Even boxes simply placed atop simple bamboo rafts. Now, without doubt, the fireboat's most famous exploitation occurred when the Han Dynasty strongman and usurper Cao Cao, actually the Art of War's first known commentator, undertook the ill-fated campaign that concluded with the infamous Battle of Cherbi, or Red Cliffs, largely as portrayed in a well-known movie. Having solidified his hold on the north, the ambitious Cao Cao moved south to launch an attack on the state of Wu in the southeast. Prior to the actual battle, he deployed some secondary forces to fragment the enemy's power, but the thrust of his campaign was simply moving his vastly superior naval and infantry forces down the Yangtze River. The ensuing debacle has been attributed to a number of factors, but the crux is simply that Wu's commanders effectively exploit the devastating power of an incendiary attack on the river's broad but still confined expanse. Cao Cao's defeat virtually ensured the empire would be sundered into three for decades. Well-disguised incendiary boats eventually appeared, including one intended for close combat known as the mother and son combo. Its lethality was premised upon it being set aflame after colliding with the enemy's craft, presumably a much larger and more valuable one. Essentially a shell 35 feet in length and 20 in width, it had a slotted stern that concealed a small boat. After ramming or hooking an enemy vessel, it would be firmly lashed to it with a slippery line. The Marines on board would then fire rounds of arrows while they set fire to their boat, to their own boat, then surprise their enemies by abandoning it, rowing off in the small craft concealed in the rear. The interlaced mixture of oil-drenched reeds and faggots would easily generate enough heat to ensure both vessels were consumed by fire. Following the Battle of Cherbi, hundreds of ships of every description were incinerated in single encounters, sometimes even 1,000 or more in an extended series of clashes. Although unimaginable energy and resources had been required to construct these flotillas, they vanished in the space of a day. The Battle of Cherbi may also be found in our battle section.